Here at Multipolarista, I do regular coverage of the new Cold War, that is the second Cold War, that the United States and its allies in Europe are waging not only against Russia, but also against China. And we've seen many signs of this new Cold War developing over the past decade, going back to the Obama administration, which declared a pivot to Asia, which really means pivot to war in Asia. Then we saw in 2014 the imposition of Western sanctions on Russia. During the Trump administration, we saw a massive escalation of the U.S. new Cold War on China with sanctions and a trade war. And then that really escalated into this outright proxy war that we see in Ukraine. Now, the U.S. started this proxy war in Ukraine back in 2014 by organizing a coup that violently overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected government. And then Russia has also escalated this proxy war by invading in February 2022, which is, of course, something that the U.S. and the EU were pushing for by ignoring all of Russia's security demands, by expanding NATO right up into Russia's borders. And we now see NATO saying very openly that it is waging a new Cold War on both Russia and China. And we saw a clear acknowledgement of this in the 2022 Strategic Concept document that was published by NATO after its Madrid summit, that was in Madrid, Spain, on June 29th and June 30th. What is the Strategic Concept? This is the name that NATO uses for its plan, its blueprint, outlining its strategy and its tactics. The 2022 Strategic Concept is the first NATO plan released in 12 years. The last one was in 2010. Roughly every decade on average, NATO, this US-led military alliance, releases a plan announcing what its goals are, announcing what its tactics are. This 2022 Strategic Concept is quite clearly the declaration of a new Cold War on both Russia and China. And today in this video, and you want to listen to a podcast version as well, I'm going to be discussing the main points of this 2022 NATO plan and its acknowledgement that it's waging a new Cold War on both Russia and China, and the significant implications this is going to have for the world. Not just for the US and Europe, for the entire world. And we also see that NATO is now drawing in the Pacific region. So before I get into the main meat of this report, I'm just going to summarize some of the main details of this strategic concept published by NATO. I published an article about this over at multipolarista.com. It's called NATO's 2022 Plan Declares Second Cold War on Russia and China. You can get all of the links to everything I talk about in this video and podcast here over at multipolarista.com. Just look for this article. You'll get all of the links, all of the sources. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the main points of this strategic concept, the main summary. First of all, the document refers to Russia and China as strategic competitors, and it calls them authoritarian actors that pose, quote, systemic challenges. That is, systemic challenges to the US-led Western imperialist system. NATO specifically singles out Russia, calling it, quote, the most significant and direct threat. So this is NATO saying very clearly, Russia is our top threat. NATO exists to wage this hybrid war against Russia. But for the first time in one of these strategic concept plans released by NATO, it also significantly devotes a lot of time to talking about China. That's new. And the document refers to China also as a systemic challenge and a strategic competitor. And it claims that the People's Republic of China, quote, challenges our interests, security, and values, and that Beijing supposedly, quote, strives to subvert the rules-based international order. Now, the rules-based order is this concept that the US government has been trying to popularize to replace international law, because the US government can't control international law. The international law is created by international institutions and largely through the United Nations. The US government can't control those institutions, and because the US government is seeking to maintain its unipolar hegemonic control over the entire world financial, political, and economic system, it is trying to rewrite international law and the concept of international law and replace it with the rules-based order, within which, of course, the United States makes the rules and the United States orders people around. That's the rules-based order. And this NATO document repeatedly refers to this concept of the rules-based order. It doesn't talk about international law rooted in the United Nations. It talks about the rules-based order, and that order is, of course, dominated by the United States and Wall Street, with their junior partners in London, and specifically the City of London and the banks of London, and then, of course, Brussels and the unelected bureaucrats of the European Union and the European Central Bank, which is representing the German banking interests and the German large industry, large corporations. So this document says very clearly that NATO sees Russia as the top threat and China also as a significant systemic challenge, striving to subvert the rules-based order dominated by the West. And specifically, the document really goes out of its way to warn about this growing alliance between Russia and China. I have done a lot of coverage of this. I have videos about this, and I also have an article that really details how important the China-Russia strategic partnership is. And you can find that at multipolarista.com. The article is called "China and Russia Declare New Era of Multipolarity, Challenging U.S. Interventionism." So NATO says very clearly that this alliance between China and Russia is a significant threat to Western hegemony. And it says that, and this is in the language of the 2022 strategic concept, quote, "The deepening strategic partnership between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation and their mutually reinforcing attempts to undercut the rules-based international order run counter to our values and interests." So again, we see this concept of the rules-based order in which the United States makes the rules and orders everyone around. So they say that the alliance between China and Russia threatens the U.S. hegemonic system, which is true, of course, but NATO is saying that Russia and China are our main enemies because they're challenging this US-led imperialist system that was created by Washington after World War II with the creation of the Bretton Woods system to create an economic architecture dominated by Washington and Wall Street. And then NATO was created in 1949, so the United States could subordinate Europe to the United States and create this cross-Atlantic imperialist axis, whereas in both of the world wars, World War I and World War II, Europe was fighting among itself. They were inter-imperialist wars between various imperialist European powers, especially France and Germany being the main imperialist powers. And the United States created NATO to subordinate Europe to US imperialism and to unify the West in this cross-Atlantic imperialist bloc to wage war against socialism around the world. They succeeded in the First Cold War in overthrowing the Soviet Union and overthrowing and destroying other socialist governments. NATO in the 1990s destroyed the last socialist government in Europe, which was in Yugoslavia. NATO also destroyed the socialist-oriented government in North Africa of Libya, which was the most prosperous country in Africa, in a war of aggression in 2011. And now it is dedicated to trying to destroy the Chinese socialist system and the Russian economic system, which is capitalist, but it's a kind of state-led capitalism based on economic nationalism, in which the natural resources of Russia are owned by state-owned companies. The largest banks are owned by the Russian government. So the most important parts of the Russian economy are owned by the state and managed by the state. So there is this capitalist economy, but it differs very greatly from the Western neoliberal capitalist economies in which everything is privatized and owned by billionaire capitalist oligarchs. The banking system is privatized. There is very little state control over the economy. So the second Cold War that NATO is waging against China and Russia is similar to the first Cold War, and that the first Cold War was a class war waged by the Western capitalists led by the United States, representing the imperialist world system. They were waging a war on socialism around the world. Not only in the Soviet Union, they were also waging a war on socialism in Chile with the famous CIA coup in 1973 against the elected socialist president Salvador Allende. Also, the constant coup attempts and assassination attempts and failed invasion of Cuba with the Bay of Pigs, and following that, with the Contra death squads in Nicaragua in the 1980s, with the proxy war in Afghanistan against Afghanistan's socialist government, which was backed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, with the constant coups and other operations targeting Africa, the war in Angola, the Western backed coup in Congo against the first ever elected Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. And there are so many other examples of of course, borderline genocidal wars against Vietnam and Korea and Cambodia and Laos waged by the US and the Western imperialist powers. So just as the first Cold War was very clearly a class war waged by Western capitalists led by the United States and Wall Street, with also the European corporate interests and banking interests. Similarly, the new Cold War is a war led by the financialized Western neoliberal system to try to overthrow the Chinese socialist system and the Russian state-led economic model, which again is not necessarily socialist, but it's a fundamentally different model from the Western neoliberal model. So now this brings me back to this NATO strategic concept document. This 2022 strategic concept was agreed to unanimously at the Madrid summit that NATO held in Spain on June 29th and June 30th. You can see a photo here of all of the leaders of this US-led military cartel. And again, NATO is US-led, and it's about preventing Europe from having an independent foreign policy and subordinating Europe to the United States. And at this summit that was held, NATO, not only did it release this 2022 strategic concept, but it also announced that it's further expanding. And this was a very strange NATO summit. NATO, of course, stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, although really in many ways it stands for the North American Treaty Organization because it's dominated by the United States. But this was a very strange NATO summit because there were numerous countries in the Pacific region, which is very far from the North Atlantic region. It's on the other side of the planet, that attended. Specifically, this photo here shows the Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida, who attended the summit representing Japan at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This is him shaking the hand of Jens Stoltenberg, who is the Secretary General of NATO. Also at this summit was the president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, who is a very right-wing, anti-China, pro-Western leader. And you can see he also is shaking the hand here of Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General. Joining Japan and South Korea at the NATO summit were also Australia and New Zealand, all Pacific countries, again, very far from the North Atlantic region. So this shows that NATO continues to expand into the Pacific, and NATO is not about defense, it's about US imperialist power, and it's now about waging a new Cold War, not only against Russia, but also against China. And for people who are interested, I have a report about this over at multipolarista.com titled NATO Expanding into Asia Pacific to Militarily Encircle China as well as Russia. And it shows how NATO has been, over the past few years, not just in the past few weeks or months, over the past few years, been incorporating Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand into this US-led military alliance. Now, in addition to expanding into the Pacific region, we see that NATO, and by the way, I should say that while NATO is expanding into the Pacific, we see that the language used is changing, and there now are Western leaders talking about the idea of what they call global NATO. It's what they call it, global NATO, obliquely acknowledging that the Pacific region is not the North Atlantic region. That term is also funny, the global NATO, because NATO has always been global, but whatever. I mean, Western leaders aren't very smart. So in addition to expanding into the Pacific, we also see that NATO continues to expand within Europe itself. At this NATO summit in Madrid, Turkey revealed that it had signed an agreement with Sweden and Finland. You can see the photo here of Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan signing and overseeing an agreement being signed with Sweden and Finland, announcing that Sweden and Finland are going to be joining the US-led military cartel. Finland borders Russia, and Finland, by the way, not so fun historical fact, during World War II, Finland allied with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. So Finland has a long history going back to collaborating with fascism of very anti-Russian policy, and it is now joining NATO. And Sweden is joining NATO as well, which shows that Sweden's and Scandinavia's pretense of supposedly being committed to neutrality has never been real. They've always been loyal allies of the US-led imperialist system. So Turkey worked out a deal with Sweden and Finland, which agreed to hand over Kurdish activists to be thrown into a Turkish prison, which also shows how little these Western so-called democracies care about human rights. They talk about it all the time, but they're willing to throw people in Turkish dungeons when it's politically convenient for them so they can expand NATO onto Russia's borders. So, although I should mention that NATO already has members on Russia's borders, specifically the Baltic states are already on Russia's borders. And those were also former members of the Soviet Union, former constituent republics of the Soviet Union. So, after the NATO summit in Madrid, NATO announced that it's going to be expanding its common funding for more war. And it also announced that member states had agreed to increase their military spending, that's their national military spending, to 2% or more of GDP. Countries like Spain have announced they're going to be doubling their military budget. And another very important detail about this Madrid summit, not only did NATO make it clear that it's going to be expanding into the Pacific and expanding more into Scandinavia, but it's also expanding further into Eastern Europe and the Balkans. NATO promised to increase military support for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was part of Yugoslavia, which was destroyed by NATO in the 1990s. It also promised to expand military support for Moldova, very much into Eastern Europe, which is a Russian ally. And it even promised to expand military support to Georgia and pledge that Georgia and Ukraine are going to become part of NATO. Of course, these are bordering Russia. They were former republics of the Soviet Union. And it shows once again that NATO really just is obsessed with expansion everywhere. It's like a cancer that insists on expanding around the world, and especially right up into Russia's borders in order to surround Russia with hostile military bases. This is a map of NATO expansion that doesn't include adding Sweden and Finland here. And you can see that NATO has already expanded onto Russia's borders in the Baltic states here. So NATO continues to expand to encircle Russia militarily and then into the Pacific in order to encircle China militarily. Now, in addition to this NATO summit that was held in Madrid, the G7, which is the imperialist cartel bringing together the seven wealthy countries, 6 in the West and Japan, they held a meeting of the G7 in Germany from June 26th to June 28th. So that was a day before the summit officially began. That was NATO held in Spain. And that, you can see this photo here of the leaders of the United States, Britain, Germany, France, Italy, Canada, and Japan. in the Bavarian Alps. And like the NATO conference, the G7 summit was very clearly aimed at waging this new Cold War on both Russia and China. And at the G7 summit, these Western leaders in Japan, they pledged $600 billion in funding to try to challenge Beijing's Global Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the difference is that China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is building infrastructure around the world, largely in the Global South, is estimated at many trillions of dollars, whereas the G7 is only pledging $600 billion, and that's even if they actually manage to cough up that money. And that money is also in public-private partnerships. So it's basically government contracts, government handouts to for-profit corporations in order to try to compete with China. Now, I want to talk more about this strategic concept document. In this strategic concept document, NATO refers to, again, Russia as a threat and China as a systemic challenge and a strategic competitor. But it also tries to portray this new Cold War, which, as I said earlier, is a class war being waged by the financialized neoliberal capitalist economies of the United States and Europe against the socialist model of China and the state-led economic model of Russia. Instead of portraying this new Cold War as a class war between competing economic systems, which is what it is. And for people who are more interested in that analysis, they should listen to the interviews that I've done with Michael Hudson, and there's transcripts of my interviews with Michael Hudson at multipolarista.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find those videos, or you can find the podcast version of those interviews if you look up the Multipolarista podcast. Anyway, the point is, instead of portraying this new Cold War as a class war, NATO is trying to portray this new Cold War as a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. So in this 2022 strategic concept document, NATO claims that it exists to, quote, safeguard our freedom and democracy and strengthen our shared democratic values. Now, this is very ironic and pretty absurd, considering, one, that there are numerous authoritarian members of NATO, including Turkey, which is a member of NATO. Poland, which has a far-right authoritarian regime, is still a member of NATO and the European Union. And Hungary, which also has a right-wing authoritarian regime, is likewise a member of NATO and the European Union. So NATO claims to be dedicated to safeguarding freedom and democracy. But it's also extremely ironic, as I pointed out in my report, because at this NATO summit, it featured the unelected monarch of Spain, King Felipe VI. And in fact, King Felipe VI, he introduced the NATO summit on June 28th with a special address. And in that special address, he claimed that NATO was part of a struggle between tyranny and democracy. Here is this insanely ironic video clip of the unelected monarch of Spain. Of course, Spain is a constitutional monarchy, but it's still a monarchy. The hereditary king of Spain introducing the NATO summit in which NATO claims that it exists to defend democracy and freedom. Here's that clip.
The long-standing global struggle between tyranny and democracy is as relevant as ever. Great power competition is everywhere. War goes on.
So as I note in my report here, not only did the unelected monarch of Spain introduce the NATO summit, which is supposedly about democracy, later that night on June 28th, NATO also noted on its program that King Felipe VI hosted a royal gala dinner at the Royal Palace. And I pointed out the incredible hypocrisy, furthermore, symbolically, of all of these Western leaders talking about democracy and freedom at the NATO summit. Meanwhile, they were all speaking in front of this symbol, the official symbol of the NATO summit in Madrid, featured a crown. The crown is, of course, a symbol of the Spanish monarchy, the opposite of democracy. And in addition, NATO and its official symbol for the summit, it had the NATO symbol, which, by the way, it always has struck me as quite ironic that it's like an inverted swastika. And of course, NATO was created in 1949, right after World War II, and it was created by a coalition of Western anti-communist right-wing regimes, bringing together, including former fascists, including Portugal's fascist dictatorship, was one of the founding members of NATO in 1949. And then NATO supported a bunch of former Nazis and fascists in Operation Gladio. But anyway, in addition to the ironic inverted swastika symbol used by NATO, there's also this coat of arms used by Spain on the Spanish flag. It's a modified version of that Spanish coat of arms, which is, of course, a symbol of the Spanish monarchy. So NATO claims to be dedicated to freedom and democracy, but it has numerous authoritarian members, including Poland, Hungary, and Turkey. One of its founding members was the fascist dictatorship of Portugal. And furthermore, not only did it feature the Spanish king who introduced the NATO summit, but when authoritarian Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that he signed a contract, an agreement with Sweden and Finland to allow them to join NATO, Sweden and Finland showed how supposedly democratic NATO is by refusing to allow the people of Sweden and Finland to have a democratic referendum to vote on whether or not they wanted to become part of this US-led military cartel. So the people of Sweden and Finland had no democratic input on this process of joining a supposedly democratic institution. But anyway, let me continue now looking at this strategic concept that NATO published. So it talks about Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and it reaffirms NATO's commitment to nuclear weapons. And it says, as long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. So using the threat of nuclear war hanging over the planet to pretend that it's about democracy when actually it's about reinforcing U.S. hegemony. And it also claims, once again, to be about common values of individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Once again, I talked about the incredible hypocrisy of this. It claimed the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace. It didn't mention the NATO war on Yugoslavia in the 1990s, which destroyed Yugoslavia, which destroyed peace very much in the Euro-Atlantic region. It also, of course, didn't mention the NATO war in Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021, or the NATO war that destroyed the state of Libya in 2011. But NATO claimed that, quote, authoritarian actors challenge our interests, values, and democratic way of life, referring to, of course, Russia and China. And then it calls them strategic competitors that supposedly interfere in our democratic processes and institutions. That's a reference to the Russiagate conspiracy theory, which has been completely debunked, but NATO continues to go along with this conspiracy of Russiagate. So once again, this ridiculous, hypocritical rhetoric. They call the Russian Federation the most significant and direct threat. And they claim NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to Russia, although it continues to expand under Russia's borders in the Baltic states, where in Estonia, NATO held military exercises 100 kilometers from the Russian border as recently as November of 2021. But they say they're not a threat. They're also expanding into Ukraine. They say they want to expand into Ukraine and into Georgia, once again on Russia's border, and in Finland, once again in Russia's border. So NATO continues to expand onto Russia's borders, but it claims that it's not a threat to the Russian Federation. They also say, terrorism is a threat, whatever. I mean, that's whatever. Then here's the part on China, which is a very lengthy section. They say that the People's Republic of China challenges our interests, security, and values. Yeah, values of imperialism and U.S. hegemony. They claim that China, quote, strives to subvert the rules-based international order. And then it reiterates this fear of the growing alliance between China and Russia, strengthening the so-called rules-based order in which the United States makes the rules and orders everyone around. They refer to China as a systemic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security, and again refers to China and Russia as strategic competitors. It accuses Russia of violating and selectively implementing arms control obligations and commitments. Now, this is very ironic. As I noted in my report at multipolarista.com, it's actually the United States that has repeatedly violated arms control treaties, including with Russia. Here's an announcement from the U.S. State Department back in 2019. U.S. withdrawal from the INF treaty. It shows that it's the United States that is the one that has repeatedly withdrawn from and sabotaged diplomatic agreements and arms control agreements with Russia. Here is a statement back in 2019 from the International Campaign on Nuclear Weapons, which is a group that has won the Nobel Peace Prize. And this group warned back in 2019, they said that the U.S. government withdrawal, the U.S. unilateral withdrawal from the INF treaty is an irresponsible move that opens the path for a new nuclear arms race. So they make it clear that the United States is the one that is guilty here. And this group says, again, this group that won the Nobel Peace Prize says, Trump has fired the starting pistol on Cold War II. Only this one could be bigger, more dangerous, and the world may not be so lucky this time around. So while NATO accuses Russia of supposedly violating arms control agreements, it makes no mention of the U.S. sabotaging arms control agreements, including as recently as 2019, the Trump administration unilaterally sabotaging the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which, by the way, would allow Ukraine to put nuclear weapons right on the border of Russia with a missile flight time of 5 to 10 minutes if Ukraine joined NATO, which is, of course, why Russia militarily intervened. It invaded Ukraine out of the fear that, as Zelensky had repeatedly said, Ukraine may have U.S. nuclear weapons aimed at Russia. So getting back to this strategic concept here, the document also throws in Iran, Syria, and North Korea, making it clear. So yes, NATO is about U.S. hegemony, waging war on all of these countries that challenge U.S. imperialism. And then ironically, they continue to insist that NATO is defensive. They call it an environment of strategic competition, which is their way of saying a new Cold War on China and Russia. And then they reiterate their commitment to nuclear weapons in addition to conventional and missile defense capabilities complemented by space and cyber. So NATO is committed to all forms of warfare, including nuclear, conventional, space, and cyber. And NATO also hints that it's prepared for World War III, saying that NATO is prepared for, quote, high-intensity, multi-domain warfighting against nuclear-armed peer competitors, and also in space and cyberspace. And the rest of this is just, ridiculous pablum, but it makes it clear that they're prepared for World War III with Russia and China if they think it's necessary, including nuclear war. NATO repeatedly talked about the importance of nuclear weapons. So they claim to be a defensive alliance, but they're very much an offensive alliance that destroyed Libya in 2011, destroyed Yugoslavia in the 1990s. They claim to be defensive, but NATO waged a war in Afghanistan from 2001 until 2021. So it wasn't just a U.S. war in Afghanistan. It was a U.S.-NATO war. And furthermore, it claims that, this is another very provocative act that shows that NATO is not defensive. It calls for strengthening NATO's partnership with Bosnia and Herzegovina, which had been part of Yugoslavia, which was destroyed by NATO in the 1990s, as well as Georgia and Ukraine right on Russia's borders. And it reaffirms the decision taken at the 2008 Bucharest summit and all subsequent decisions with respect to Georgia and Ukraine. That means that it's reaffirming NATO's commitment to adding Georgia and Ukraine to NATO. That was what was announced at the 2008 summit. And then, of course, it reaffirms its special relationship with the European Union, the neoliberal bankers cartel. and it calls for expanding into the Western Balkans and the Black Sea region. So this is NATO's 2022 plan, the first plan it has released since 2010, and it makes it very clear this US-led military cartel is aimed at waging a new Cold War on both China and Russia, and it is not a defensive alliance. It destroyed Libya, it destroyed Yugoslavia, it waged a 20-year war in Afghanistan, it's waging a proxy war now in Ukraine, and it is preparing for the potential of World War III, or at the very least, a second Cold War on both China and Russia. As always, here at Multipolarista, I will be documenting the latest developments in this new Cold War. But as I said, it's not about democracy. It's not about human rights. It's not about freedom. This is the second Cold War, like the first Cold War, is a class war being waged by the financialized neoliberal capitalist model led by the United States and Wall Street, backed by the bankers and big corporations in Europe, against the economic model proposed by China and Russia based on state control of natural resources and development for the well-being of the country and the people, and not just a small group of corporations and billionaire oligarchs. That's what the second Cold War is about. And here at Multipolarista, I'm always going to be reporting on the latest developments in that new Cold War that NATO has quite clearly declared with its 2022 strategic concept.